Greetings of the day, students. On behalf of Radhika Classes, I am here to share with you some of the important questions of subject BO which are expected to be asked in your March 2025 board examinations, which Radhika Classes feels and recommends you to study and prepare very well. Let us see some of the 2 markers, 3 markers and 5 markers question. First of all, we are going to see that is 2 marker questions. Section C. From chapter number 1, we have 4 important questions which are repeatedly asked. First question is explain management is a science. Our second question is explain management is an art. Our third question is explain 4 P's of marketing mix. And our last question from chapter number 1 is draw the diagram of levels of management. Here we complete with our chapter number 1 and we go ahead to chapter number 2. Our first question from chapter number 2 is what is rule of thumb? Our next question is what is scientific management? Our next question is from chapter number 3, moving ahead, where is the principle of lock and leap adopted? Our next question is state the types of budget. Our next question from chapter number 3 is in which field is planning found? Our next question, what do you mean by policy? Our next question, what is the final budget? Our next and the last question from chapter number 3 is planning is an expensive process. Why? Explain. Students, this is one of the most important questions repeatedly asked in your board examinations. Next question from chapter number 4 is explain any 4 characteristics of formal organization. Explain any 4 characteristics of informal organization. Both the organization are been repeatedly asked in your board examinations. Next question is draw the diagram of functional organization. We have only 3 questions from chapter number 4. Now moving ahead with chapter number 5, we have our first question as what is waiting list? Our next question, training is expensive but its absence is more. So explain the statement. This statement is majorly asked in your examinations. Our next question from chapter number 5 is state the internal source of recruitment. Our next question, what can be known through IQ and aptitude test? Our next question, what can be known through trade and psychological test? Our last question from chapter number 5 is staffing is more merely an employee welfare activity. Why? From chapter number 6, moving ahead, we have our first question, state the intellectual qualities of a leader. Next question is what is co-partnership? Now moving ahead with chapter number 7, we have our first question as how an internal process is controlled. Our next question is planning and controlling are the 2 sides of the same coin. Explain. Here this question is asked more times. Please refer this question, students. Next and the last question from chapter number 7, we have planning is the father of controlling. Explain. Moving ahead with chapter number 8, our first question we have is explain the points of difference between gross working capital and net working capital. Our next question is what is production cycle? Our next question is what is mean by optimum capital structure? Here we complete with chapter number 8 and move ahead with chapter number 9. Our first question is what is call money and notice money? Our next question is what is organized money market and unorganized money market? Our next question is what is mean by contract note in the purchase sale procedure of securities? This question is majorly being asked, students. Our next question is stock exchange is a minor indicating economic condition of the country. How? Here we complete with our chapter number 9 and moving ahead with chapter number 10. First question from chapter number 10, we have mention any 4 characteristics of a good salesman. Our next question is what is the need of the storage of goods? Continuing with chapter number 10, we give the meaning of money research. Our next question is list out the advantages of labeling. Our next and the last question from chapter number 10, we have is state the difference between advertisement and publicity. Difference has been asked. Please students, please note that and prepare it with point of difference. From chapter number 11, our first question is give the full form of CGSI and CUTS. Full forms are also asked repeatedly, so do not forget to prepare it. Now, our second question is how the consumer are physically and mentally exploited. Our next question is write a note on the principle of trustship and consumer protection. Our next question, chapter, that is 11th chapter, and our first question from chapter number 11 is explain in brief about eco-friendly products. Our next question is mention the steps taken by government for encouraging foreign investors in share market. Our next question is give the cultural factors affecting the business environment. And our last question from chapter number 11 is explain any two important objectives of fiscal policy. For 2-marker questions from our last chapter, we have our first question as mention the steps taken by government for encouraging foreign investors in share market. Our next question is give the cultural factors affecting the business environment. And our last question from chapter number 12 and 2 markers is explain any two important objectives of fiscal policy. Here we complete with our 2-marker questions and moving ahead with our 3-marker questions, that is your section D. From chapter number 1, our first question is give the meaning of marketing management and explain 4 P's of marketing mix. And next question is explain management as a profession. Second and the third question is explain the characteristics of coordination. Our last question from chapter number 1 is state the functions of production management. Moving ahead with chapter number 2, we have our first question as into which 6 parts Henry Fayol divided his entrepreneurial activities, clarify. Our next question from chapter number 2 we have is discuss about Peter F. Drucker contribution in management field. Please note students, this question has been asked repeatedly, so do not forget to learn this question. Our next question from chapter number 2 is explain the following principles in short. We have given you 4 important principles, but any principles can be asked. And the 4 important principles are number 1, A. Division of work, B. Esprit de corps, C. Unity of command, and D. Scalar chain. From chapter number 4, we have our first question as explain the meaning of linear organization with the help of a diagram. Next question from chapter number 4, we have discuss 6 characteristics of an informal organization. Our next question from chapter number 4, explain elements of delegation of authority. And next, draw a diagram of functional organization and explain. This question is also being asked. Draw a very neat diagram using pencil and scale. Next, directly moving on to chapter number 7, we have our first question as explain the stages of controlling process. Our next question, explain corrective measures in control process. Our next question is controlling an end activity of management. Why? This question is also asked an important question. Please note students. Next and the last question from chapter number 7 is planning and controlling are the 2 sides of the same coin. Explain. Here we complete with chapter number 7, moving ahead with chapter number 8. Our first question from chapter number 8 is explain the characteristics of ideal capital structure. Next, difference between fixed and working capital. Difference should always be given with point of difference. Moving ahead with chapter number 9, we have our first question as explain the functions of stock exchange. Our next question, explain the characteristics of money market. Our next question, what are treasury bill? Explain. Our next question, describe the characteristics of stock exchange. And our last question from chapter number 9 is explain the functions of SEBI. Now, moving ahead with chapter number 10, we have our first question as difference between marketing and selling. Our next question is state any 6 characteristics of branding. Our next question, what is the role of advertisement? Next question, explain any 3 factors that affects pricing. Our last question from chapter number 10 is mention the characteristics of a good salesman. Now moving ahead with chapter number 11. Our first question from chapter number 11 is explain about consumers exploitation. Our next question is how is consumers awareness created? Our next question, explain the importance of consumer protection from the viewpoint of business. Now moving ahead with our last chapter for 3 markers, we have our first question as state the positive effects of globalization. Our next question is state the negative effects of globalization. Our next question, state the positive effects of privatization. And our last question for 3 markers from chapter number 12 is state the negative effects of privatization. Here we complete with our 3 marker questions. Moving ahead with section E and 5 marker questions. 5 marker questions from chapter number 1, we have draw the diagram of levels of management and states the function of level of management. Here any one level can be asked to you students. Top level, middle level or bottom level, any one level will be asked to you. So prepare it very nicely for chapter number 1. Now directly moving ahead with chapter number 3. Our first question from chapter number 3 is give the meaning of planning and explain its characteristics. Our next question is explain the process of planning. Our next question is explain the limitations of planning, and next question discuss the types of planning. Now here we complete with chapter number 3 and directly moving ahead with chapter number 5. Our first question from chapter number 5 is give the meaning of staffing and explain the importance. Our next question is give the meaning of recruitment and explain its internal sources. Radhika Classes believes that these are one of the most important questions. So please prepare it students. Next question, explain the meaning of recruitment and explain its external sources. Our next question is explain the process of selection. Our next question, difference between training and development. Students, please note with point of difference you are supposed to write your differences. Now our last question from chapter number 5 is explain the characteristics of staffing. Moving ahead with chapter number 6, we have our first question as explain the need hierarchy of Maslow. This is one of the important questions to be asked in your board examinations. Next question is discuss the financial and non-financial incentives in brief. Next question, difference between formal and informal organization. This is also one of the most important questions to be asked in your March 2025 board examination. Next question, define directing and explain its characteristics. Our next question, explain barriers to overcome barriers of effective communication. Our next question is explain the barriers of effective communication. Here we complete with chapter number 6 and moving ahead directly jumping to chapter number 11. Our first question for chapter number 11 is explain 3-tier redressal system for grievance. Our next question is explain the responsibility of consumer according to the Consumer Protection Act. Our next question is explain the rights of consumer according to the Consumer Protection Act. Here we complete with our 5 marker important questions. If you have any queries or doubts, please contact us on the given number. Students, for your reference, we have shared a link with you in the description for which you can download the PDF of the same questions. All the best, keep coming, flying high and come out with flying colors. Students, all the best. If you like this content, do like, share and subscribe. Thank you.